Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us at this amazing opportunity to hear one of the most important scholars that we have on the topic of moral injury. I wanted to get all of her titles right, so we're looking on our little website to do that. But first, let me say to you that I have been at, first of all, let me say that I'm Rosemary Bray McMahon. I'm president of Starr King School for the Ministry. And I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon for the Starr King President's Lecture. Our lecturer this year is Reverend Dr. Gabriella Lettini. She is the Dean of Faculty at Starr King, and she is the Aurelia Henry Reinhardt Director of Studies in Public Ministry and Professor of Theological Ethics. I have known Gabriella since we were both in New York, and working, she was at Union, I was a pastor in New York, and I met her while she was beginning the work along with Rita Nakashima-Brock on the very important topic of moral injury. That was in the early days when there was a kind of Truth and Reconciliation Commission going on at Union, when people were coming to Union for a couple of days to talk about their experience with moral injury, and to have many of us as witnesses to that process. And Gabriella was key in that work. She arrived at Starr King in August of 2005 and is in charge of our Master of Arts in Social Change program. She also collaborated with a group of women faculty to create a certificate in women's studies in religion at the Graduate Theological Union, of which Starr King is a part. Dr. Lettini earned her MDiv at the Waldensian Theological Seminary in Rome, Italy. She is an ordained minister of the Waldensian Church, a movement that originated in France and Italy in the 12th century and was based on evangelical poverty, a critique of church hierarchies, refusal of the church as a political power, and a strong emphasis on lay leadership, including women. Does that sound familiar? Persecuted as heretical, the Waldensians joined the Reformation in 1532. So we have some deep commonalities there. She served Waldensian and Methodist churches in Italy from 1987 to 1992. She also earned her PhD from Union Theological Seminary in New York City under the supervision of Dr. Dolores Williams and Dr. James Cone. She also served as an ecumenical associate at Jan Hus Presbyterian Church in New York. Her dissertation, The Allergy to the Other, focused on contemporary theological perspectives on otherness. Before accepting her position at Starr King, she taught at Union as a visiting assistant professor of theology and culture and collaborated with the Poverty Initiative at Union Theological Seminary. She served in several poverty truth commissions in New York as well. She engaged the same grassroots model for truth commissions for that as she did with the issues of war. Those hearings that I talked about happened in March of 2010, and they released their official report on Veterans Day, and they have written a book together called Soul Repair, Recovering from Moral Injury After War. It was published by Beacon Press, our own press. And so it is an honor to have someone of Dr. Lettini's deep theological grounding and deep social activism to give this year's Starr King President's Lecture. I give you Reverend Dr. Gabriella Lettini.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me well? Let me know when that is not the case. Well, first of all, thank you to all of you for being here. There are so many interesting events happening at the very same moment. And in the time we have together, I would like to offer you an introduction to the concept of moral injury and how it has been used primarily to describe the spiritual struggles many veterans face in the aftermath of war. I will spend some time doing this. And then I would like to address how moral injury can be a helpful framework to address the spiritual struggles many of us may be facing from our different social locations in the aftermath and in the midst of systemic injustice, with a special focus on the violence of white supremacy. My approach will be intersectional, as I will take as a given and stress how personal experiences of moral injury are different depending on one's social location and relationship to power. Before there are definitions, there are lives, there are people, there are stories that people tell to make sense of their lives. And only much later do scholars come into the picture and try to organize the stories. Sometimes they misrepresent them, overimposing their points of view, erasing their complexities, and silencing some of the voices. Yet other times the interpretative process has integrity and does offer some glimpses of understanding and meaning, and this enables other stories, important stories and truth, to be told. I first heard references about moral injury through personal witnesses, well before I read about it in books. I learned about it from the words of veterans of the conflicts in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan when I was working on the Truth Commission on Conscience in War, starting in 2008 up to the year in 2010. And I was working with my colleague, Rita Nakashima-Brock. The stories that we heard had to do with a sense of profound transgressions of one's sense of moral order, even in situations where one was following orders or was fighting for survival. After witnessing the horror of war, following orders they did not believe in, some soldiers could not forgive themselves and could no longer make sense of the world. Some veterans framed this as moral injury, something that brought many on the verge of suicide. I like to credit veterans for our growing understanding of moral injury as it relates to war, but also in a broader sense, because their lives and their stories came first, and only later scholars tried to capture the sense of what is happening out of the common elements in these particular stories. And yet it's also true that when this terminology started to become more mainstream, more and more people, more veterans find it helpful themselves and say, oh, this is exactly how I felt. They didn't use the terminology themselves, some of them, but they started using it. Psychiatrist Jonathan Shea, author of Achilles in Vietnam and Odysseus in America, is usually recognized as having coined the term moral injuries in the 1990s. For Shea, moral injury is a betrayal of what is right by someone in a position of legitimate authority in a high-stakes situation. His use of the word injury was very intentional, as his goal was to convince the military to treat it as a wound or par with bodily harm. The language of injury and wounds, Shea argued, will be a significant step in treating psychological, moral, spiritual harm, as it will change the military's values that praise physical injuries as a form of sacrifice and consider psychological and spiritual issues with some suspicion as a sign maybe of weakness, lack of courage, or moral fiber. Shea originally approached moral injury as an issue caused by the betrayal of the moral order by someone in position of authority, specifically within the military. That person may have caused or forced others to betray their own values. For Shea, when people in authority act in contrast with the stated value of their world and organization, they create a ripple effect that can be witnessed and felt with the force of a physical attack. The betrayal of what is right is not just disappointing, but destructive of the integrity of the group and the individuals around them. Puts people at odds with the ethical culture of the group. Sometimes a sense of lack of meaning can ensue. Shea was very clear that he was not discovering or defining anything new. It was not a new phenomenon, but he was trying to explain in contemporary terms the moral struggles that many experience after war and violence, as witnessed by the oral and written traditions of many cultures across history, and also by the veteran he was working with. Many veterans that had worked with Shea, in fact, did find his definition very helpful and truthful. And while he was an early supporter of the Truth Commission on Conscience in War, and he was very involved in their work, we also find that his definition lacked some of the complexity that we heard in the veteran stories. Many of these stories address a sense of betrayal by the superiors, that is true, or the military machine in general, but the focus of their anguish was the injury they had inflicted upon themselves by the choices of the reflective actions that they had taken in war. I am making this distinction between choices and reflective actions, specifically because after World War II, US soldiers have been trained to shoot reflexively, bypassing any moment of our decision making. And some of our police force today received that training. The words of veteran Camilo Mejia haunted me before I even had the occasion to get to know him and have long conversation with him face to face. Camilo, a Nicaraguan and Costa Rican citizen, moved to the US in '94 with his mother and his brother, and he joined the military at 19, thinking that if the US would go to war, it would be only, quote, for a very good cause, to bring freedom to other lands. And in his writings and interviews, he also acknowledges the financial strain that pushed him to seek an education in the military, as it happened to many, but disproportionately to people of color. In fact, when he arrived to the US, he worked all day to go to high school, study for high school, and then when he graduated, was working full-time and a minimum wage job at Burger King. But when he applied for college, he was refused financial aid because apparently he was making already too much money. So he didn't know what to do, was recruited by the army, and he thought that was a good way to get a college education. It's for many a common story. While Camilo Mejia was against the particular war in Iraq, once he was deployed there, he thought that he could put his principle aside, do his duty, go back home. Sorry? Sorry? Okay, can you hear me? Okay, thank you for telling me. So he thought he could just go to Iraq, do his duty, go back home, and then he realized that he was utterly unprepared for the reality of war and the way he would dramatically change him and challenge his conscience. In the documentary Soldier of Conscience, he said, quote, "Nothing ever prepares you for going to Iraq and seeing the destruction of an entire nation. Nothing ever prepares you for the unmeasured killing of civilians. Nothing ever prepares you for what that does to you as a human being, to kill an innocent person. Nothing is going to really prepare you for the level of destruction that you bring upon a nation and you bring upon yourself for being part of it. And yet I have a conscience, which goes way beyond any law. It goes way beyond any order that I can receive." End quote. Camille also recounts of not being aware that he was shooting 11 times against a young Iraqi man, another brown man. He had no awareness and still had no memory of it, but he had to face the fact when he counted the number of bullets he fired and saw that the man was dead. He was appalled that his agency had been taken away by his training. He also recounted a story of ongoing and systematic abuses of prisoners of war, often innocent civilians or petty criminals arrested randomly in the streets. He was the first combat veteran to come back from Iraq and go public with his condemnation of the war in 2004, after he decided to go absent without leave and be in hiding for a while to reflect about what to do. Arrested at a press conference, he was court-martialed and sentenced to a year of prison. Yet, he claimed he had never felt freer because he was following his conscience. So in Camilla's words, we hear that the transgression of one's conscience in war can bring both personal and collective destruction. On the personal level, Camillo realized that he could be annihilated by his own sense of guilt and despair unless he told the truth about his action and took responsibility with himself, first of all, then publicly. He faced military prison rather than continuing to be in war. And he educated others, both military and civilians, about the moral cost of war. To this day, he has been engaged in a life of justice-making that cannot erase his killing of innocent people, but allows to leave him in the tension between the knowledge of what he did and the possibilities that he can also bless the world. As the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan continued, soldiers came back with more stories. The numbers of veteran suicide reached an alarming high of at least 18 and up to 22 a day, much higher than the civilian population. In addressing this crisis, in December of 2009, a group of Veteran Affairs clinical psychologists published a study that identified moral injury as a wound of war that is related but is also different from PTSD. The study used the same terminology of moral injury, but broadened the definition by Jonathan Shea. According to this study, by Brett Litz and others, moral injury is not a pathology, it's a spiritual wound caused by perpetrating, failing to prevent, or bearing witness to acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. This study claimed that the long-term impact of moral injury can be emotionally, psychologically, behaviorally, spiritually, socially devastating. Sometimes it can last an entire lifetime, and it can foster internal conflicts so severe that can bring people to suicide. Clearly, moral injury then was not PTSD, because PTSD is a trauma response whose symptoms include flashback, nightmares, dissociative episodes, hypervigilance. And one can develop PTSD after any kind of accident. Moral injury instead is a form of judgment. It's a negative self-judgment based on having transgressed core moral beliefs and values, or feeling betrayed by someone's authority that transgressed these values. It is reflected in the destruction of a moral identity and loss of meaning. Symptoms include shame, survival guilt, depression, despair, addiction, distrust, anger, a need to make amends, sometimes loss of a desire to live. Sometimes one can feel moral injury just after a particular situation, or may come to the realization after years of struggle and reflection. We heard stories about this. So this understanding of moral injury is closer to what Camillo and other veterans were describing, as it integrates both the betrayal from superiors in a high-stakes situation with the recognition that one had also betrayed one's own conscience, one's own sense of right and wrong. In the words of another veteran, Michael Yandel, open quote, "Moral injury is not a veil that obscures what really happened. It is a ripping away of the veil, a permanent showing, a continuous truth-telling. I know I am not who I thought I was. I am something different, something I never planned to be. Moral injury results from exactly this kind of irreversible schism between one's perceived moral sense and one's actions. A person is morally injured when she comes to recognize herself, when she has witnessed herself failing to live by her own moral conviction, especially in profound and demanding circumstances. For veterans, these circumstances were, however directly or indirectly it is experienced. Yandel does describe moral injury as an acute sense of identity crisis that is at the same time a sort of moral absence. When he saw the fear in the eyes of Iraqi civilians, he realized that the moral self that he had thought he had cultivated his whole life was actually not there. And in that absence, in that void, Yandel could not feel the presence of God either. The unveiling that he was describing is not only an unveiling of who he had become, but of the fact that he realized he was never who he thought he was. He wrote, "Before the war, I thought of myself as good, someone capable of choosing goodness. I recognize now that I am not good and that I have never been good in the way I used to imagine. Yet, to think that I can heal from such recognition, or that my moral injury is somehow reversible, is a false pathway to hope. Rather than returning to some glorified past, I must come to terms with who I am, and then must look towards becoming something new." End quote. This sense that moral injury is not something reversible is something I heard from many of the veterans we talked with. When Rita Nakashima Brock and I decided to title our book of moral injury, Soul Repair, Recovering from Moral Injury After War, it was with the sense that the repairing does not bring back a previous state of innocence, of goodness or well-being. It is not an undoing, but an intentional engagement with one sense of factual moral self, an engagement that requires truth-telling, self-confession, ongoing reparation, a reparation that is never an erasure of what happened, and a different new way of being in the world. In one of the many discussions I had with Camillo Mejia, something that I recount in Soul Repair, I confess that I deeply resonated with his framing of moral injury, as I, as a white European, since a young age had been struggling with a deep sense of inner laceration, born of the awareness that my very life depended on the exploitation, suffering, and that of so many around the world, a whole history, and that Christian Europeans carried the burden of the gravest systematic atrocities in the history of humanity. And yet I was also pretty much aware of the many ways in which I, a woman from a poor working class background, from a discriminated religious minority, in a very patriarchal society, was also a victim of the system that I was complicit with. And I was also often a powerless, sometimes desperate bystander. So I asked Camillo, may I also use the framework of moral injury to describe my own spiritual struggle? And he answered, yes, but with caution. Yes, because moral injury is a way to describe a set of human reactions, a spiritual struggle that is clearly not only occurring in relationship to war. Yes, also because even in war, the whole society that sends people to war should take the moral burden for the pain and destruction caused by war. He also said, although with caution, because having directly taken the life of another human being is a uniquely tragic experience that someone who did not kill could never understand. Camilla also told me that he thought a generalized sense of moral injury may much more easily be set aside when it's convenient. He felt that this was never the case for him. He felt that moral injury was like a backpack. He could never take on and off as he wanted, but it was his weight that he had to carry constantly and forever. It has always been clear to me that moral injury could not and should not be seen only as an individual injury or a personal struggle when dealing with situations of systemic violence and injustice. Camillo and other veterans we work with in soil repair always stressed the fact that they wanted the US society to acknowledge their responsibility for the wars. They wanted the whole society, independently from their political beliefs, to also carry the burden of the moral injury for the war. Unfortunately, what is happening most often, it is that while the military has started acknowledging moral injury and training people to address it, the burden is still primarily on the soldiers themselves as individuals. And while it is very important that current programs within and outside the Veteran Administration help veterans engage with their sense of moral injury so they can live in community, the whole collective and political engagement for the whole nation in relation to war is not really happening. The moral injury of war and perpetual war is not being addressed as a national conversation. I argue that this is not all that I heard in the urgency of the witnesses of so many veterans like Camillo Mejia, but also Joshua Castillo, Tyler Boudreau. All of them have published their own books and material. I think their hope in speaking about their moral injury was not only to support individual veterans, and this is happening, support the families and communities, but they also wanted to help the whole society to engage spiritually and politically with their own sense of moral injury in relation to war, so that deeper transformation and restoration could be plausible, or at least a process in that direction. This was also my hope in engaging with the concept of moral injury. So if moral injury is a human response to being in a situation of violence and oppression that are in contrast with one's moral codes, what does the fact that as a US society we have not articulated and not discussed a shared sense of moral injury about war say about us, about we as a people, in the way we relate to all forms of historical system of moral and spiritual betrayal? And I'm thinking about slavery, genocide, police brutality. We could make a long list. As I started speaking about moral injury, and even more after the publication of Soul Repair, so many people came to me or wrote to me and told me about their own stories and how they connected with a sense of moral injury. Many World War II veterans came to me with tears in their eyes, confessing that since they had fought a good war, they never felt that they should or could speak also about the profound inner conflicts that they felt for the violence they had done or they had witnessed. Women veterans who were the victims of military rape spoke about the complexity of the experience of deep betrayal by their peers, the military justice system, and also their own new self-understanding of their role in war. Some victims of sexual abuse by family members, teachers, spiritual leaders, thought that moral injury could also speak about their own experience of betrayal that caused them to doubt the very existence of any moral order and meaning. Many people connect the moral injury to their awareness of the irreversible damage some humans have done to Earth, in particular about climate change. How to live not only with the awareness that the environmental destruction was irreversible, but the knowledge that we as white citizens of the First War, they were complicit in that destruction. One former student wrote about an accident where she caused the death of a young immigrant man. After many years, she published that article publicly. Others wrote to me about moral injury and how it resonated with the struggles of researching their family history and having to deal with the fact their family used to own slaves. Nurses told me that they experienced moral injury when they could not prevent someone from suffering or dying, or when they had to follow a doctor's orders that they thought was wrong. A few retired police officers confessed they experienced moral injury, both about specific incidents and about the increased militarization of the police force. Many told me their stories about how experiences of racist or homo or transphobic macro and microaggression are a constant cause of betrayal and spiritual injury. Many women, after the election of President Trump, told me that having a sexual harasser as the president felt like an injury from the whole nation, or at least from the people that voted for it. Today, studies on moral injuries are happening in different areas of work, in different cultural contexts, and describe the experiences of a variety of people: nurses, doctors, teachers, social workers, drone operators, body handlers, first responders, inmates. Feminist scholar Carol Gilligan spoke about the moral injury experience when at some points girls in their upbringing are taught that they are not as much, they are less than their male classmates. International researcher chronicled the sense of moral injury in asylum seekers in Switzerland. The betrayal and the injury they experience when, after having escaped violence, are met with more inhumanity. While we can share Camillo's concerns that labeling all sorts of moral struggle as moral injury may trivialize the experiences of veterans of war, I think we need to honor the variety of people's experiences with moral injury and notice that they are consistent with the definition of moral injury we have been addressing, the one that says moral injury is perpetrating, failing to prevent, or bearing witness to acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. If we embrace this definition of moral injury, we may find a useful framework to address the spiritual suffering that comes from being the victim, perpetrator, or witness of acts that transgress our sense of justice and our sense of self as moral being. And if we engage this understanding of moral injury with an intersectional analysis, with attention to our differences of power, we also bypass the clear danger of universalizing particular experiences and silencing others. We will avoid blurring the difference between victims and victimizers in specific time and context. while also honoring the sense of personal responsibility in situations when one is an impotent bystander, or the fact that in our lives we may experience all of the different roles in different moments. Jewish Italian writer Primo Levi, that came from my same hometown, a Holocaust survivor, addressed the complexity of these feelings in many of his writings. He puzzled over why people like him, that in the concentration camps had been subject to such cruelty and powerlessness, should feel shame and guilt just for what they had witnessed. He writes, "It was the shame which we knew so well, which submerged us after the selection, and every time we had to witness or undergo an outrage. The shame which the just man experiences when confronted by a crime committed by another, and he feels remorse because of his existence, because of its having been irrevocably introduced into the world of existing things, and because his will has proven non-existent or feeble and was incapable of putting up a good defense." End quote. This shame, I think, comes from an uncovering of the veil that showed human nature in all of its brutality. It's something that when is seen cannot be unseen. And yet Levi was also concerned to stress the difference between victim and victimizer, and that difference was not ambiguous in many cases. He wrote, "I know that I was a guiltless victim and I was not a murderer. I know that the murderers existed and still exist, retired or on active duty. And to confuse them with the victim is a moral disease or an aesthetic affectation or a sinister sign of complicity. Above all, it is precious service rendered intentionally or not to the negators of truth." End quote. I think that a multifaceted definition of moral injury helps us to encompass a wide spectrum of spiritual struggles and honor different standpoints and power relationships in the face of moral outrage, the moral outrage of violence and oppression. This means that we could find a common language to speak about the spiritual damages caused by injustice without claiming that we are experiencing them in the same way or for the same reason, or that we are all responsible in the same ways. A broader definition of moral injury is therefore, in my view, more spiritually and politically relevant and accurate. It also allows for multiple and diverse voices to use that paradigm to tell their different stories without homogenizing and censoring them, and most importantly, without universalizing of particular experiences. As I said at the beginning, I wanted to focus on an understanding of moral injury, then moving to ask a question about how moral injury as a concept could be helpful in helping to talk intersectionally about the spiritual dimension of the violence and damage caused by white supremacy. So this is the beginning of a much larger study and conversation that I hope we will have some now and in the future, a conversation that I hope is always intersectional. At the inaugural session of the Moral Injury Group of the American Academy of Religion 3 years ago, Jessica Vasquez-Torres, a self-defined 1.5 generation English as a second language queer Latina of Puerto Rican descent, presented a paper asking whether moral injury has a color. And she addressed her experiences of moral injury in relation to white supremacy and racism in the United States. Vasquez-Torres said that we should never speak about racism without speaking about white supremacy, which she defines as structural arrangements that misuse power in ways that benefit whites and destroy all non-whites. For her, moral injury was experienced at the hands of white supremacy in the invisibilization of her Latina identity and in a discovery of her own internalized oppression in relation to race, gender, sexual orientation. She also articulated how white supremacy pushes different oppressed groups to silence, to compete, or to fight with each other instead of fighting white supremacists. She argued this is one of the many injuries inflicted by white supremacy. The moral injury that white supremacy causes in people of color will be to question the very foundation of their reality and identity. To know that one is a worthy human being and yet not to be treated like one. To know that one is a citizen and has human rights and civil rights and yet not to experience them on a daily basis. To know that one people has a history of history and yet never read them or read them accurately in history books. Both egregious acts of racism and racist microaggressions in daily life continue to fertilize the soil of white supremacy and deepen the wounds of moral injury. I think that white supremacy is a system of oppression that constantly exposes us, depending to our relationship to white power, to perpetrating, failing to prevent, or bearing witness to acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. The definition of moral injury we have been engaging. US society claims to value freedom and justice and respect of human dignity. Most of the country's founders and most of those currently holding political power in the US self-identify Christian, speak of a good, just, and loving God. Yet the US is a society founded on colonial violence and slavery. And this history of violence and exploitation benefiting whites, and particularly the 1%, is still alive today in our national and in international political life. So I ask, how could centuries of constant, systematic infringement not only of one's stated values and religious beliefs, but also of universally recognized basic human rights, not cause a deep spiritual fractures in individuals and in collective souls? What if the constant referring to the greatness, uniqueness, exceptionalism of this nation really hid an attempt to run away from the real story, from the fact that systemic violence, the systemic violence that is white supremacy is at the very core of the foundation and current functioning of this nation? What if white denial of the history and current lived reality of people of color in this country was a constant deepening of the spiritual wounds inflicted on the victims of this silencing and erasing? Dr. Del Andrew, a Christian theologian of African descent, has started studying moral injury in white people. In his speech, The Moral Injury of Anti-Racism, he's explored the idea that the majority of white people steeped in politics of resentment and resistance to social justice, especially resistance to racial justice, may actually be fighting against the moral culpability. Why so many white people claim a state of victimhood and resist accusation of racism? Why do they act like they are the ones being injured, he asked. What is the injury that caused white resistance? If I understand him correctly, Dr. Andrew posits that whites may be experiencing moral injury when they are faced with the fallacy of the claims of superiority or Western white hegemony. White people, or most of them, may not be able or willing to accept that they might not be who they think and say they are. And this is experienced as a cataclysmic wound that just cannot heal. Dr. Andrews asks this powerful, complex question that still resonates with me. He asks, how do perpetrators of racism live between the charge of abuse, the defense of innocence, the guilt of duplicitous privilege, and the outrage of perceived unjust accusations? That is his question. While whites may feel morally injured when confronted with our anti-racist claims, I think they may actually fight against the experience of their own moral injury. How can one accept to be both a heir and a beneficiary of some of the worst transgression against humanity, and still think of oneself as good? How can whites accept their moral duplicity as people that claim to be good and innocent, and yet are also so culpable, so responsible? How can they still believe in a moral universe if they really came to face to face with their history and privileges and injustices of the present? How can they accept themselves as perpetrators of injustice when in so many instances in their lives they are also definitely the victims of some kind of oppression? We heard from veterans that moral injury can cause persistent distress, lack of meaning, guilt, shame, rage, depression, loss of confidence in one's motivation and abilities, collapse of meaning. What if so many whites, in reaction to this fracture of the souls, think that they have been attacked and injured from the outside by whoever they construct as the other, instead of admitting that the injury is internal and it comes from their histories, their ancestors, their parents, from themselves, their faith traditions? Camilo Mejia's image of moral injury as a backpack that he could not take on and off, but had to carry forever, started resounding with another image that, as a white person and educator, I had engaged for over 20 years since I came to the United States. It's the image of another backpack that Peggy McIntosh used as a metaphor in the famous article, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. This knapsack is where white people carry their privileges without being aware of it. This knapsack can certainly contain other privileges too, in relation to gender, class, ethnicity, sexual orientation, ability, speciesism, and more. What if that invisible baggage of privilege, different privileges, also contain the moral injury that weighs on our soul? I learned from Camilo that to be able to live with moral injury without causing more suffering and destruction to oneself and others is to become aware of it, to name it, to accept to carry its burdens as something that we have to carry at all times. It's just reality, it's just responsibility. One needs to perceive and be a witness to the damage one has inflicted on others, focusing on their pain, not on ours. And yet, at the same time, honestly addressing the pain caused to others, being engaged in repairing the damage caused, is exactly what can make one's moral injury bearable and even transformative. Camilo actually now says that he thinks he's a better man now because of his moral injury than he was before. In this sense, moral responsibility in relation to moral injury has two meanings. It is both an admission of culpability and the ability to respond to the aftermath of injustice, and to create a new understanding of who we are as moral agents. To understand the depth of moral injury means to know there is no fast forward to forgiveness, as premature forgiveness, premature self-forgiveness require amnesia or anesthesia or erasure of the full extent of the harm inflicted. Months ago, I decided to title this lecture, An Injury to All, from the labor slogan of the industrial workers of the world of Wobblies. An injury to all. An injury to one is an injury to all. The slogan addressed the need of all workers to organize as a class, creating deep solidarity with each other across gender, racial, and ethnic differences, so that the oppressive system of capitalism could be overthrown and people could finally live in harmony with the earth. I think that the slogan can also speak spiritual and theological truth about the damages of oppression and violence. While they affect us differently, the damage is to the whole fabric of life, that is a fabric of complex interrelationship. It is an injury to all. What if we engaged in an intersectional analysis as a spiritual practice that lead us to acknowledge and speak the truth about our historical traumas and our own present, while also addressing the bonds that connect us in the tapestry of life. While addressing moral injury may seem to lead to even more despair or division, what if its inherent critique of all that is oppressive and damaging may be necessary for the regeneration of the fractured social fibers of humanity? What if it can lead us to reimagine who we are and who we could be as human beings and as part of nature? What if it is the only pathway to justice and healing? There are questions that my students will engage in a course that is a required course for all Starr King students. It's called Educating to Counter-Oppression and Build Just and Sustainable Community. And this has been a core commitment of Starr King for over 15 years. And the whole class is now taught as a ritual moment for the whole week, where each day we ground ourselves in a deep sense of awe for the mystery of life, of gratitude for our lives, or respect for the tapestry of life. We pray for each other and ask for the love that contains all of us to hold us in our discussions. But then we discuss. It is the kind of space that allows us to make the pain of injustice and the recognition of our different standpoints in relation to systemic injustice. That space allows us to make this recognition bearable. This is the kind of space that, by fostering this conversation, is a space that also nurtures hope and transformation in the face of hard truth-telling. This is the kind of space where we can address our moral injuries and learn that we have to carry and how to carry our different knapsacks with our different privileges so we can better do the work of justice and spiritual leadership. It is not a perfect or perfectly safe space, but a space ripe with possibilities nevertheless. I think spiritual communities are called to keep creating, nurturing, protecting spaces where these exchanges can take place. Finally, I offer this understanding of moral injury as a framework or lens, hoping it might be helpful in interpreting and engaging our different spiritual struggles in the face of injustice and violence. The injustice and violence that we perpetrated, suffered, witnessed, or failed to prevent. I hope that this might generate some reflection and interesting conversation, some here and in the future. Thank you.